Hello, welcome to the National Park Service and the Federal Aviation Administration public meeting for the Draft Air Tour Management Plan for the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. I'm Michelle Carter, an Environmental Protection Specialist with the National Park Service, and I'll be your moderator for this evening. I'd like to start off by defining a couple of acronyms that you'll hear us use. You'll hear us refer to the National Park Service as NPS, the Federal Aviation Administration as FAA, and the Air Tour Management Plans as ATMPs. We'll define the remaining acronyms as we go along with the presentations. Next slide, please. We're holding this virtual public meeting to review the draft ATMP for Great Smokies and to seek public feedback on the draft. The meeting tonight is being held pursuant to the National Parks Air Tour Management Act of 2000, also known as NPATMA, and its implementing regulations. You'll hear a little bit more about NPATMA and the draft ATMP shortly, along with information on how you can submit questions and your official comments. But before we dive into the presentations, I'd like to take a minute to introduce our presenters and provide a little bit more information about the meeting logistics and how you can participate. Next slide, please. So joining us this evening as presenters are Keith Lusk, Program Manager and Special Program Staff with the Western Pacific region of FAA. From the Natural Sounds and Night Skies Division of the National Park Service, we have Vicki Ward, Overflights Program Manager, and Adam Biko, Social Scientist and Overflights Planner. And from Great Smoky Mountains, we have the Park Superintendent, Cash. Keith and Vicki are going to provide a brief overview of NPATMA and the purpose of today's meeting. And then we'll hear from Superintendent Cash and Adam, who will share a little bit more information about the park-specific resources and talk a little bit more about the park-specific draft ATMP. Next slide, please. Throughout the meeting, we invite you to submit your questions, which we'll address after the presentations as part of the Q&A session. Questions that are submitted through today's meeting will be considered by the agencies as they continue drafting the ATMP, but they're not actually considered formal comments. Next slide, please. All official comments must be submitted through the NPS Planning, Environment, and Public Comment site, or PEPC, as we call it, or you can send them to the mailing address that's listed on the park's PEPC site. Only comments received through one of these two avenues will become part of the official record. The agencies are not accepting comments via email, and we'll share a little bit more information about how to comment later in the presentation. I also want to note that all comments should be received on or before October 3rd of this year. Next slide, please. This meeting is being live streamed across Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And if you're watching on one of these platforms, you can submit your questions using the link to a Google form that FAA will post into the chat area of whatever platform that you're using. And when the time comes, we'll read your question aloud and our presenters will respond. We're going to do our best to get to all of the questions, but in the event that we don't get to your question, we will provide contact information where you can go for post-meeting follow-up. Our overall meeting will be 90 minutes long and will adjourn at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. If we get to a situation where we get through all questions early, we're going to keep the meeting active until 6 o'clock in case additional questions come in. And please note, this meeting will be recorded. We appreciate you joining us this evening to learn more about the Smokies draft ATMP. We're now going to play a short video before I turn it over to Keith and Vicki to provide additional details about NPATMA and why we're here today.
The United States is home to some of the most breathtaking national parks and tribal lands in the world. It is important that we protect these lands while ensuring that the public has ample opportunity to enjoy these national treasures. Air tours offer the public a totally different type of experience. The Federal Aviation Administration and the National Park Service work together to manage air tours over national parks. We are developing plans that help protect wildlife, wilderness character, cultural resources, natural soundscapes, and visitor enjoyment. These plans are known as Air Tour Management Plans. and today we will explore the specifics of the draft plan for your park. As part of our planning process, we consult with tribes, Native Hawaiian organizations, state and tribal historic preservation officers, and wildlife biologists. We assess noise, wildlife protection, and other environmental considerations, and we will continue to make adjustments to these plans as needed. And we consider the appropriate level of National Environmental Policy Act review for these plans. The FAA and the National Park Service are committed to ensuring safe flights at our national parks while safeguarding park resources. Following today's presentation, we encourage you to review your park's draft air tour management plan and provide official comments through the National Park Service Planning, Environment, and Public Comment website. Together, we can celebrate these special places and ensure they can be enjoyed for generations to come.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Keith Lusk. I'm a program manager with Federal Aviation Administration. I'm here today with my counterpart from the National Park Service, Vicki Ward. What we want to do is provide you with a little bit more information about the National Parks Air Tour Management Act, as well as a little bit of context on the Air Tour Management Plan itself. Next slide. The National Parks Air Tour Management Act was enacted in April of 2000, and then there were subsequent amendment provisions added to that original legislation in 2012. Basically, at a high level, what the Act requires is that the FAA, in cooperation with the Park Service, has to develop air tour management plans, or ATMPs, for those parks and tribal lands where there's commercial air tour operations. And those are from air tour operators who have applied to the agency to conduct air tours over those parks. It's important to realize what the Act applies to and what it does not apply to. So when we're developing an air tour management plan for Great Smoky in this case, it really only covers and addresses commercial air tour operations that are over the park. It addresses only those commercial air tour operators that fly over the park or within a half-mile boundary of the park, and also over tribal lands that are within or abutting the park. And in terms of the airspace that we're looking at when we're developing these air tour management plans, it's from basically ground level to 5,000 feet above ground level over the park and over the half-mile buffer associated with that. So if someone was transiting the airspace over Great Smoky and flying at 6,000 feet above ground level, they would not have to fall under the requirements of this plan or that Act. It would not be considered a commercial air tour operation of Great Smoky. Next slide, please. As noted, this only applies to commercial air tour operations. It does not apply to other types of aviation activity, specifically general aviation activity, commercially scheduled airline or commuter flights, or military flights. It also does not apply to any park units in the state of Alaska. When the original legislation came out in 2000, the Act specifically exempted national park units in Alaska from having to comply with the requirements of this Act. Also, Grand Canyon National Park is not covered under the National Parks Air Tour Management Act. It has its own legislation, its own oversight and regulations. So that is not something that's addressed under this Act. Also, the original legislation of 2000 specifically prohibited any air tours from occurring over Rocky Mountain National Park. One of the 2012 amendment provisions provided for low activity parks not to have to do an air tour management plan or a voluntary agreement. And basically, the legislation says that if there are 50 or fewer annual air tour operations at a park, that park would become exempt, i.e. from the provisions of the Act and the requirement to develop an air tour management plan. It does allow, however, in that provision that the Park Service can withdraw the park from the exempt park list and have to do an air tour management plan, even though the number of operations are below 50, if they feel the need that it's necessary to protect park resources, visitor experience, or other types of resource concerns that the park may have. Great Smoky does not fit within the definition of an exempt park. It has well above 50 annual air tour operations. If the abutting tribal lands may be overflown in the conduct of the tour of the park, we would have to invite the affiliated tribe in those lands as a cooperating agencies for compliance with the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. We'll talk a little bit more about environmental compliance and NEPA in some later slides. Next slide, please. The Act makes a distinction between two types of operators. Commercial air tour operators needed to apply and need to apply in the future to the FAA for operating authority in order to conduct air tours over a national park unit or abutting tribal lands. This process is laid out specifically in the Act, and it identifies a distinction between what is an existing commercial air tour operator and a new entrant air tour operator. Existing commercial air tour operators are those operators that were flying and conducting tours over a specific park before enactment of the Act. So before April of 2000, if an air tour operator happened to be flying over Great Smokies, they would be considered an existing air tour operator at Great Smokies. They needed to apply to the FAA, and when they did that, they applied and told the FAA that this is the number of flights they were flying in the year before 2000, i.e. 1999, or the 3-year average of the 3 prior years. And FAA granted that air tour operator what is called interim operating authority. And that's basically a not to exceed annual limit on the number of operations that our air tour operator can conduct at the park until such time as the agencies develop an air tour management plan or voluntary agreement. We're obviously at this point developing an air tour management plan. At the point when the air tour management plan does become final, that interim operating authority that was previously granted to the operator goes away, and they would need to fly in accordance with the requirements of what's in the final air tour management plan, which may have a different number of allocations or annual tours that that operator may be able to conduct over that park. Conversely, a new entrant commercial air tour operator is an operator that applies to the FAA to conduct tours over a park after the Act came into effect. So after basically April of 2000, we have not had any for new entrant operators to conduct tours at Great Smoky. Specifically, there are 2 existing commercial air tour operators, i.e. operators that have been flying over Great Smoky specifically for the last 2 decades. So this air tour management plan, to clear up any confusion, we're not looking to introduce new air tours over Great Smoky. These are operators that have been conducting commercial air tours over the park for quite some time. The air tour management plan will put some requirements, some restrictions, some measures to better control their operations and reduce effects to park resources. Next slide, please. And I think I'll be turning it over to Vicki.
Yeah, thanks, Keith. I'm Vicki Ward from National Park Service, and I will continue with the overview of the National Parks Air Tour Management Act. The Act actually specifies what the objective of an air tour management plan needs to achieve, and that is to develop effective and acceptable measures to mitigate or prevent the significant and adverse impacts, if any, resulting from commercial air tour operations upon natural and cultural resources, visitor experiences, and tribal lands. Next slide, please. The Act also specifies what the contents of an air tour management plan must include, and it may prohibit commercial air tour operations in whole or in part. That could be seasonally, could be over parts of the park where air tours are allowed, or there are parts of the park where they're not allowed. Just different ways to achieve that. The air tour management plan also may establish conditions such as including routes and altitudes of the flight, time of day restrictions, such as operating hours during the day, restrictions for particular events. That could be something happening at the park where they don't want air tours nearby for that particular event, and also could establish a maximum number of flights, and that could be on a yearly basis, that could be on a daily basis. That's all allowed in the air tour management plan. As mentioned previously, the commercial air tour operations this applies to are within 1/2 mile outside the boundary of the national park and below 5,000 feet above ground level. An air tour management plan must also include incentives for the adoption of quiet technology. These are models of aircraft that are quieter than the traditional models of aircraft, such as different helicopter or fixed wing models. The air tour management plan is also to provide for allocations to conduct the air tours when the ATMP limits the number of operations. And then each air tour management plan will include a section that justifies and documents the needs for the measures that are taken in the air tour management plan, such as why the routes are where they are, why particular altitudes have been specified, and other restrictions to demonstrate protection to park resources and visitor experiences. And also those justifications are included in the record of decision. Next slide, please. Now this next slide, if people might be calling in via phone, this is a picture of the United States, which shows the locations of the parks where we are working on air tour management plans. FAA and NPS are currently developing air tour management plans for 24 parks across the United States. So obviously here today, we were talking about Great Smoky Mountains National Park draft air tour management plan. We also have a couple in the Eastern US, but a lot of the parks we're working on are in the Western US. So there's a group of parks in Utah, a couple in South Dakota, Washington, the San Francisco Bay Area, and we're also working on air tour management plans out in Hawaii for Hawaii volcanoes and Haleakala National Parks. Next slide, please. So as also required under the National Parks Air Tour Management Act, we develop these air tour management draft plans and publish the availability of the plan in the Federal Register. We hold at least one public meeting to get public input and comment into the development of that plan, which is why we're hosting this meeting today. And also the air tour management plan process will comply with the National Environmental Policy Act and other legal requirements such as the National Historic Preservation Act and the Endangered Species Act. And as mentioned previously too, we invite tribes to participate as cooperating agencies for the National Environmental Policy Act compliance in cases where the tribal lands are or may be overflown by air tours. And just to reiterate why we're here today, just we're reviewing the components of the draft air tour management plan. And we thank you for joining us today. And with that, I will turn it back over to Michelle and Superintendent Cash. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Vicki, and thanks, Keith, too. So now we'll hear from Superintendent Cash and Adam Biko with a little bit more information about the draft ATMP and the park resources.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Cassius Cash, and as introduced, I'm the superintendent of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. First, I want to start by welcoming everyone and to thank each of you for taking the time to join us this evening. I also want to give a personal shout out to Vicki and Keith for their detailed overviews and also to you, Michelle, for moderating this public meeting this evening. To reiterate, the main purpose of today's call is to hear directly from you and to respond to your questions on the draft ATMP for the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Your input is very important to us, and I'm looking very much forward to hearing your feedback. I'll be providing a brief overview of the park for those that haven't had a chance to experience this beautiful place. Next slide, please. The park is located in the heart of the Southern Appalachian Mountains in East Tennessee and Western North Carolina. The Smoky is world renowned for its diversity of plant and animal life and the rich history of people who live in these mountains, from the Cherokee people to the early settlers. Most of you know the park is the most visited national park with over 12 million visits per year, generating nearly $1 billion into the local economies. The park encompasses roughly 522,000 acres, of which almost 90% is either recommended or proposed wilderness. The park's enabling legislation from 1926 states the park was established for the enjoyment of the people. In addition to these rich resources I'm mentioning, the park offers a multitude of ways for people to experience this park, including over 850 miles of trails, 384 miles of scenic roads. You got camping, you got picnicking, you got fishing, and you also have horseback riding. Next slide, please. I want to take a minute and point out a few key features on the park map to help people get oriented. For those viewing on the phones or may not be able to see the map, I'm going to do my best to briefly describe the park. So first, the length of the park is approximately 70 miles. The Tennessee-North Carolina border runs east to west, and through the center of the park, if you can imagine, that's where the highest peaks of the park are located. The Appalachian Trail extends along the state boundary, which dissects the park for most of that 70 miles. The Foothills Parkway. The parkway parallels the main body of the park from the Chehawaii Lake on the western end of the park to the Interstate 40 on the eastern side of the park. So if you've been on the parkway, you personally know it provides unparalleled scenic views of the Smokies. Now, there are 4 visitor centers in the park as well, and some of those are co-managed outside the boundary, like the one that's in Gatlinburg, located near the park roadway connecting Pigeon Forge and Gatlinburg. We call that the Spur. The map also lists numerous historic districts and other cultural resources, which will be discussed on the next slide. That's it. Next slide, please. I want to briefly discuss some of the park resources that are being considered in the ATMP process. First, I want to acknowledge the long human history of the area we now call the Smokies. Native Americans have used this land for centuries. Many tribes, as you know, attach religious or cultural significance to lands within the park. Specifically, I want to mention the Cherokee Indians, including the eastern band of the Cherokee Indians, whose lands border the park to the south of us. It is important to note here that the proposed air tour routes do not fly over these tribal lands. The park is a landscape filled with various types of cultural resources, such as archaeological sites, historical buildings, historic districts, and the Native American sensitive sites, and traditional cultural properties. The park also contains numerous National Register eligible or listed cultural resources that are important as we are preparing this draft ATMP. Those include the Appalachian National Scenic Trail, the Case Cove Historic District, the Elkmont Historic District, the Walker Sisters Place, and the Cleveland's Dome Observation Tower. The park is currently working through the Section 106 process of the National Historic Preservation Act, which will be discussed in more detail later in this presentation. Another key resource considered in the planning efforts of the Smokies is the Great Smoky Mountains Institute at Tremont, which is on the Tennessee side of the park. It's on the south end near Townsend, Tennessee. Tremont is an experiential educational center that offers immersive outdoor education programs. Next slide. The park is also home to an incredible diversity of life, including several federally threatened and endangered species such as the Carolina northern flying squirrel, the Indiana bat, as well as sensitive species such as the bald eagle and peregrine falcon. Because of this remarkable biodiversity, the park was designated as an international biosphere back in 1976 and a World Heritage Site in 1983. No other area of this similar size and climate has as many documented species of plants, animals, and invertebrates. I'm always blown away by the amount of species that have been identified in this park. So for those that don't know, we have over 21,000 species that have been identified. And this is really mind-boggling that we have 1,044 new species that are new to science. That's incredible. So before I turn it over to Adam Becko to talk about the existing air tour conditions, I think that you will find, I hope at least you will find that this plan balances the economic viability of air tour businesses with the need to also protect these special resources that I've been talking about, because it's these very resources that provide our visitors a true sense of place, as well as a quality visitor experience, which you're going to hear us talk more and more about this afternoon. So we look forward to hearing your feedback. I encourage you to get engaged. Thank you. And Adam?
Thank you, Superintendent Cash, for the wonderful introduction to the park resources. Again, my name is Adam, and I work for the Natural Sounds and Night Skies Division of the National Park Service, and I'm based in Fort Collins, Colorado. First, I'm going to discuss what is currently happening at the park with respect to air tours, and then I will discuss the proposed draft ATMP. Currently, there are 2 commercial air tour operators at Great Smoky Mountain National Park: World Helicopters Incorporated and Great Smoky Mountain Helicopters Incorporated. The operators hold the interim operating authority that Keith mentioned earlier for a combined total of 1,920 annual flights. However, based on the 3-year average reporting data from 2017 to 2019, World Helicopter Incorporated conducts an average of 864 commercial air tours at the park each year. And Great Smoky Mountain Helicopter Incorporated is estimated to conduct 82 commercial air tours at the park each year. Due to some reporting confusion, these 82 air tours are not included in the reporting data. In total, between both operators, the 3-year average is 946 as compared to the 1,920 IOA that is the current annual limit. All routes flown by both operators are flown between 1,000 feet and 1,500 feet. AGL, or above ground level. Altitude expressed in above ground level units is a measurement of the distance between the ground surface and that of the aircraft. Under existing conditions, the annual number of commercial air tours at Great Smoky Mountain National Park is limited by this IOA. However, there are no designated parameters on route, time of day, altitude. There are no procedures to establish no fly periods, and there are no training or education requirements for the operators. The provisions and conditions in this draft ATMP address these parameters in a manner designed to protect park resources and the visitor experience from the effects of commercial air tours and support National Park Service management objectives for the park. Next slide, please. On this slide, you'll see a table, and this table directly compares the existing conditions for air tours against what the draft ATMP proposes. So on the second line, you'll see the number of air tours authorized per year. So as I just mentioned, IOA is 1,920, but the 3-year average for the park is 946 flights per year. Under the draft ATMP, the annual cap would be 946 annual tours moving forward. And the third line is altitude. Currently, there are no restrictions. However, operators report flying at altitudes between 1,000 and 1,500 feet above ground level. The draft ATMP proposes that air tours fly no longer than 2,600 feet above ground level. Aircraft types, there are currently no restrictions. The air tour operators currently report flying helicopters. In the draft ATMP, the operators will continue to fly helicopters. Time of day restrictions. Currently, there are no restrictions. Air tours may occur at any time. Under the draft ATMP, operators may operate 2 hours after sunrise until 2 hours before sunset. However, the National Parks Air Tour Management Act requires what we call a quiet technology incentive. And so this quiet technology incentive indicates that if the operators have aircraft that qualify as quiet technology, they can operate between sunrise and sunset. Day of week restrictions. Under the existing air tour conditions, there are none. They may occur any day of the week. Under the draft ATMP, operators can still operate any day of the week, but the NPS can establish no fly periods for special events or park plan management. Reporting requirements. Under the existing air tour conditions, operators are required to report their air tours. But under the draft ATMP, operators will be required to submit, will continue to be required to submit reporting. But there are also some additional conditions listed here in this table, including operator training, when that can be made available by the National Park Service. There's an option for the annual meeting if the FAA require that. There is specific or specified in-flight communication frequencies that the operators will communicate on to increase safety of air tours. There are specific route allocations and daily allocations, which we'll be discussing in a moment. And the draft ATMP also prohibits hovering by aircraft. Next slide, please. For those on phones or other small devices who may not be able to see, I'm currently displaying a map of the park, which includes the air tour routes in the draft ATMP. I'll briefly describe this. The commercial air tours authorized under this ATMP would be conducted on the routes shown on this slide. These routes were modified from the existing routes submitted by the operators in the following ways. You see the red tour. The red tour was slightly modified to concentrate as the air tours entered the park. It was slightly modified to concentrate that entry over road corridors, specifically Highway 321, Highway 441, and Little River Road. And then as the air tour continues across that portion of the park, it will fly over and exit the park near Ware Cove Gap Road. The light blue route was also slightly modified. Again, as it enters the park, the flight route is now designed to be concentrated over the road corridors. But as it turns into the park, the route will now be required to stay 1 mile south of the Elkmont Historic District and the Tremont Institute. And then if you look at the black route, again, as the route enters the park, it's concentrated over the transportation corridors. And then as it goes deeper into the park, the route was modified to require that it stay at least 1/2 mile north of the Appalachian National Scenic Trail and 1 mile north of Cades Cove Historic District. Also, this black route is restricted to 26 flights per year. The blue route, which is the longest route that you can see on this map, is also modified. And similar to the black route, this route was modified to stay at least 1/2 mile north of the Appalachian Trail and 1 mile north of Cascades Historic District. And because of the length and spatial extent of this route, it is limited to only 17 flights per year. And finally, you have Great Smoky Mountain helicopter routes, which are the orange and purple routes. These routes only extend over the Foothills Parkway and do not, but are required to stay at least 1/2 mile outside of the remainder of the park. Next slide, please. So I spoke a moment ago about daily restrictions. This ATMP includes restrictions on the number of air tours that the operator may conduct each day. These restrictions provide a maximum number of air tours that may be conducted on standard days, but allow for a limited number of flex days on which the maximum number of air tours allowed is slightly higher. World Helicopter Incorporated may conduct up to 4 commercial air tours per day, and Great Smoky Mountain Helicopters may conduct up to 1 commercial air per day on standard days. The operators are each authorized up to 40 days per year, we call these flex days, during which rural helicopters may conduct up to 5 commercial air tours per day, and Great Smoky Mountain helicopters may conduct up to 2 air tours per day. Next slide, please. So justification for the measures taken. The provisions and conditions in this draft ATMP are designed to protect park soundscapes, visitor experience, wilderness character, wildlife, visitor experience from the effects of commercial air tours, and support the National Park Service management objectives for the park. The number of air tours authorized under this ATMP is consistent with the existing reported air tours over the park. The annual flight limits in this ATMP are intended to protect the visitor experience, including the NPS interpretive programs, the backcountry experience, and cultural resources throughout the park, as well as wildlife, by limiting the number of potential disturbances caused by commercial air tours. The annual limits are consistent with the existing air tour operations reported over the park. Annual flight limits on the black route and the blue route, which we just spoke about a moment ago, are further intended to protect the acoustic environment and the backcountry experience for visitors in the park. These routes fly much further into the park, which can create noise in otherwise quiet and noise-sensitive areas, including the backcountry. Further, these longer routes also have a much larger noise footprint and produce much longer duration of noise than other routes. The altitude restrictions in this ATMP are consistent with the National Bald Eagle Management Guidelines, Raptor Protection Guidelines, and other general concerns about wildlife, specifically avian species and migratory avian species. Nesting eagles and raptor habitat exist across the park, and these nesting locations may change over time. Therefore, the minimum altitude extends across the entire park. Sunrise and sunset are also important times of day for wildlife and for visitors. Biologically important behaviors for many species occur during this time, such as dawn chorus for songbirds. Wildlife viewing is often conducted by visitors during this time of day as well. These daytime restrictions have been included in this ATMP to protect park resources. Restrictions for particular events are also intended to prevent noise interruptions for park events and tribal practices. Next slide, please. The daily operation limits included in this ATMP in the form of standard days and flex days are intended to reduce the number of intrusions of non-natural sounds across the park, while also improving flexibility to operators during high demand periods. Routes assigned as part of this ATMP are intended to protect the visitor experience and acoustic resources of the park by allowing flight routes within existing transportation corridors, avoiding noise-sensitive wildlife habitats, and avoiding cultural resources. Aligning routes with transportation corridors, including Highway 321, Highway 441, Little River Road, and Ware Cove Gap Road, helps mask noise created by air tours. Other specific resource protection measures associated with each route include the following. For the red route, the placement of the red route avoids the Elkmont Historic District, Walker Sisters Place, and Little Greenbrier School, which are all noise-sensitive cultural resources. The light blue route placement also avoids Elkmont Historic District and the Great Smoky Mountains Institute at Tremont, which is intended to protect these cultural resources as well as the education and interpretive programming of the park. Both the black route and the blue route placement avoids the Appalachian Trail as well as Cave Coast Historic District, both of which are noise-sensitive resources. Operator training and education facilitates effective implementation of the ATMP by making sure that operators remain informed regarding the requirements of the ATMP, including any changes or amendments that may be necessary. It also advances operator understanding of park management objectives and priorities, including noise-sensitive areas, and provides opportunities to enhance the interpretive narrative for air tour clients, and increases understanding of the parks by the air tour clients. The annual meeting will be used to review and discuss implementation of the ATMP between the park staff, the local FAA Flight Standards District Office, and all the operators, and will serve to ensure air tour operators are aware of the terms and conditions of the ATMP and are made aware of new or reoccurring concerns that the park may have. And with that, I will pass it back to Keith Lusk with the FAA.
Thank you very much, Adam. Appreciate that detailed readout of the specifics of the plan. And thank you, Superintendent Cash, for that valuable information about the park and the resources. Very informative. Thank you. As I mentioned earlier, the agencies need to comply with National Environmental Policy Act. The development of the Air Tour Management Plan, this ATMP, is considered a federal action subject to NEPA review. And NEPA essentially requires agencies to consider the effects of their action on the human and natural environment. And the effects are obviously stemming from the commercial air tour operations in terms of where they're flying over the park, at what height, how many times, the frequency. So that's all been considered or is under consideration right now in the analysis, in the development of this plan. We also need to determine the appropriate level of environmental review. There's various levels of environmental review with federal actions in terms of documentations, ranging from categorically excluded actions to environmental assessments to environmental impact statements. Obviously, we would need to prepare the associated environmental review documents associated with this plan, and we will be going final or sharing those with the public when we do go final. At this time, the FAA and the Park Service are considering developing the Air Tour Management Plan under National Park Service categorical exclusion. However, this is where we're at right now at this point in time. Obviously, we're going to consider, both agencies are going to consider the comments that we received during this 30-day public comment period from all the stakeholders as well as the public at large, and other want to provide comments to the agencies to consider. We will also be informed from the consultation processes that we're currently undergoing in terms of endangered species and national historic properties and those types of considerations, as well as our dialogue with the tribes that are affiliated and have historical links to this area. And we're going to fully assess the environmental impacts before making any final decision on the appropriate level of environmental review. There's a couple special purpose laws that agencies are also required to comply with. I touched on those in the discussion I just had right here. The first being Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. The other one being Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act. If we can go to the next slide, please. I'll give a brief overview of Section 1. Basically, we are currently in process working with the Park Service to complete these consultations. It includes the requirement that the agencies define the undertaking and identify the participants. We've done that. We've identified the undertaking. We have a list of participants and consulting parties that we've been reaching out to coordinate and consult with. The other thing that we need to do is determine the area of potential effects and identify those historic properties within that area of potential effects. We've identified that, and we've what our definition, our proposed definition of that area looks like. We're awaiting feedback from the tribes and other consulting parties regarding that. Then the next step in this ongoing process is to assess the effects to the historic properties. And those effects are obviously usually driven by, in this case of this federal action, from the air tours themselves, potentially noise or visual impacts associated with these tours on potentially affected historic properties. And really the last step is to resolve any adverse effect to those historic properties. So we've initiated the consultation with a number of tribes. I think 8 to 10 tribes we've coordinated with in the development of this Air Tour Management Plan. Those consultations are ongoing. We will not finalize the Air Tour Management Plan until the 106 consultations have been finished up. We've also reached out to the State Historic Preservation Office, as well as a number of other consulting parties for this federal undertaking. And with that, I will be passing it back to Michelle, who's going to touch on Endangered Species Act.
Thank you, Keith. So as Keith mentioned, the FAA and the National Park Service are complying with Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act, or ESA, as they develop the draft ATMP. And this ensures that the proposed action does not jeopardize the existence of any species listed under ESA or result in the destruction or adverse modification of designated critical habitat. And the agencies have had informal consultation conversations up to this point with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the preliminary assessment by the agencies is not anticipating these type of impacts. Next slide, please. So as noticed earlier, we are inviting comment from the public, tribes, other agencies, and all interested parties on the draft. And comments must be received by October 3rd. And comments, I mentioned this earlier too, can be submitted one of two ways. Can either be submitted online through the NPS public comment website or Pepsi, and you'll see the link here on the slide, or by mail to the address also listed here on the screen. If you miss this address and choose to submit something by mail, you can also get this address on the parks website. And the agencies are not accepting comment by email. So I'd like to also let you know that there is a FAQ document posted to the parks website that has a lot more good information, and it's sitting right next to the draft ATMP. So if somebody from FAA could drop a link to the Pepsi page and to the social media platforms at this time, it would be appreciated. Next slide, please. So following the end of this public comment period, the FAA and the NPS will review all of the formal comments that we receive and use them to inform the final ATMP. We'll continue to coordinate and complete the tribal Section 106 and the Section 7 consultations. And the process will conclude, the NEPA process will conclude as they sign a decision document. And once all of this is wrapped up, the ATMP will be considered complete, and it'll be available on both the FAA and the NPS websites. FAA will then update their operations specifications for each air tour operator. Next slide, please. Okay, so with that, I'd like to say thank you to all of our presenters, and we'll turn now to the Q&A portion of our meeting. For anyone that may have joined during the presentations, I'm Michelle Carter. I'm an environmental protection specialist with the National Park Service, and I'm serving as the moderator of the meeting this afternoon or evening. So if you have a question you'd like to submit, you can do so using the Google form by clicking on the link that FAA is sharing in the chat area of whatever social media platform you're using. And a reminder that the questions that you submit today will be considered as the agencies continue drafting the ATMP, but they're not official comments. Official comments must be submitted either through that Pepsi site I mentioned or to the mailing address here on the slide on or before October 3rd this year. And I also mentioned this at the beginning of the meeting, but the total time will be 90 minutes and we'll adjourn at 6 p.m. Eastern time. In the event that we get through all of the questions that are coming in or continue to come in, if we get through those early, we'll keep the meeting active until 6 p.m. just to allow for any other additional questions as you've had a chance to think through the presentations and reflect on what you've heard. So with that, I'll move us over to our questions, and it looks like we do have a few that have come in here. And I think we'll start off by a question that we'll send to Keith. And Keith, the question is, what flights does this plan apply to?
Okay, thank you. I think I touched a little bit on that in some of my earlier slides, but it is something I think that warrants covering again, just to clear up any potential confusion amongst the public who may be new to this or listening in for the first time about air tours over parks. But basically the legislation in this plan only cover commercial air tours. They don't cover military flights, general aviation, or other types of air tour activity. The definition of a commercial air tour is specified in FAA regulations 14 CFR Part 136, and basically, a commercial air tour over park is a flight conducted for compensation or hire in a powered aircraft for the purposes of sightseeing over a national park or within a half-mile boundary of the park. And as I mentioned previously, in terms of the altitude of the airspace associated with that park boundary and the half-mile buffer, it's air tours that transit through anywhere from ground level to 5,000 feet above ground level. So if you're outside of a half-mile buffer of the park or above 5,000 feet above ground level, and you happen to be doing an air tour, you would not be captured or covered under this plan. You would be outside the parameters of the Act. So hopefully that answers that question.
Great, thanks, Keith. And the next question will go to Vicki. The question is, why are you trying to introduce air tours to the park?
Okay, yeah, thanks for that question. This is just not a new program. Just want to make sure we get that out there. These air tours have been flying over the park for over 20 years. These two operators are currently authorized to fly a combined total of 1,920 commercial air tours per year over the park. And that was granted under interim operating authority. And that was the only part that the air tour operations that was being managed. What we're doing with this plan is that we're setting the routes and the altitudes and other operating conditions to manage the air tours in a way that protects the park resources and visitor experiences. And just letting things continue under interim operating authority doesn't do that. So what the average, though, has been for the last 3 years is 946 commercial air tours over the park. And that's the number that's being proposed in the air tour management plan. So it's a reduction from the current maximum allowed. And as we presenters went over during earlier, that this draft air tour management plan includes the routes, the time of day restrictions, and other restrictions for particular events. So until that air tour management plan gets in place, none of those conditions will be met. And so that's why we want to get an air tour management plan in place. Thank you.
Thanks, Vicki. Okay, looking at the next question, it's going to be, looks like it's a two-part question. The first part we'll give to Keith, and then the second part we'll introduce a new face from Great Smoky Mountains, the Chief of Resources Management, Lisa McGinnis. So Keith, the question for you is, were the companies conducting these flights consulted in the development of this plan?
So basically, we have had conversations with the operators in the last year or two to collect some additional information from the operators, primarily in terms of routes and altitudes that went into the preparation of this plan. We've also utilized reporting information that operators have been providing to us for the last 7 or 8 years. So we have utilized kind of what are the operating characteristics of each of those two businesses, in terms of the aircraft they fly, the routes they fly, the altitudes. From the reporting information we have, time of day, in terms of when they conduct their operations, how many flights they may do in an actual day. So we do have a wealth of information. There is, under the Act, this is another 2012 amendment provision, something called a voluntary agreement, and that basically allows the FAA and the Park Service and the operators to get together and come to a voluntary agreement about kind of the contents of a plan to conduct tours over a park. The FAA would look at that from a safety provision. The park and the operators would kind of work together to resolve any resource protection issues. That's a distinct, different option than an air tour management plan, which is what we're developing here. Here we've released the draft air tour management plan to operators as well as the public and other stakeholders. This is an opportunity to hear from everyone about any concerns they have identified in the plan. And we would obviously take those under consideration before we finalize the plan. So hopefully that answers that question.
Great. Thanks, Keith. Okay, and Lisa, so the second part of the question is asking what plans are in development to protect and preserve park areas from vehicles and people in direct contact with the environment.
Thanks, Michelle. Although plans and development are not within the scope of this meeting, I will share one example the park is currently working on is the Laurel Falls Trail Management Plan and Congestion Management Pilot. This study is an effort to assess visitor experience while making improvements to better protect the resources at this popular site. So that's one of a number of plans sort of in development to address those issues.
Great, and thanks for being here, Lisa, to help us out with these questions.
Glad to be here.
Okay, the next question for Vicki. The question is, we've heard that the FAA and the NPS are planning to prepare categorical exclusions in conjunction with the various proposed ATMPs. And they're asking to please explain how a CE would meet the NEPA compliance requirement of NEPATNA.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle, and thanks for that question. As Keith mentioned earlier during the presentation, we have conducted an environmental impact analysis, and based on that, what we've done at this point, we're considering using an NPS categorical exclusion, and that is 3.3A1 from the National Park Service National Environmental Policy Handbook. And that categorical exclusion is defined as allowing changes or amendments to an approved action, which in this case is the interim operating authority that was granted by FAA. And when such changes would cause only no or minimal environmental impact. Like I said, we're completing an analysis of effects. We're still in that process. And the type of documentation that is most appropriate will be informed by the feedback we received during the public review period, consultation with tribes and under Section 106 and also under the Endangered Species Act. So we haven't made a final determination on that NEPA pathway yet. So we do want to get feedback from you tonight on this draft air tour management plan. If additional effects that haven't been identified yet exist, and we will take a look at those and decide whether or not there is the potential for adverse impacts that would make a different NEPA pathway more appropriate, such as an environmental assessment instead of a documented categorical exclusion. So like I said, we will consider public comments on the draft air tour management plan, the information obtained during consultations, and then fully assess the environmental impacts before making a final determination on what NEPA pathway is appropriate. And just to, as a reminder that a categorical exclusion does not mean it's excluded from NEPA, just means it's excluded from preparing an environmental impact statement. Thanks.
Thank you. The next question is asking if the ATMP applies to drones or only helicopters. And the ATMP does not cover drones, actually. And just an important note and reminder that launching, landing, or operating unmanned aircraft, which are drones, from national parks is actually prohibited. But thank you for the question. The next question we have, I think this will go to Keith with FAA. The question is, are either Whirl or Great Smoky Mountain helicopters requesting more than 946 per year, or requesting any other changes in the proposed ATMP? Or is there pressure from anyone else to increase the routes?
So I am not aware of any formal requests to change anything in the draft ATMP at this point. We would really only react to anything that was formally submitted, as we're talking, Michelle talked about earlier here today, as to how to submit comments through the Pepsi site that NPS maintains. We're currently in the midst of 30-day public comment period. I think there's another couple of weeks to run on that through October 3rd. So I'm not privy to what's been submitted so far, but if there is a request by someone to change the numbers of tours or altitudes or routes, that would be the arena that request should be made, so the agencies could take a look at that and review and consider that.
Okay, thank you, Keith. So this next question is for Vicki. Have the FAA and the NPS considered other alternatives to managing air tours at Great Smokies besides the proposed action? And if yes, what are those alternatives? And when will the public have the opportunity to comment on them?
Well, we're asking for comment and feedback on this draft air tour management plan. So if you have all other alternatives you would like us to consider, please provide a comment with the information and that we've provided on how to submit those comments, and then include in that the alternative you would like us to consider. Thank you for the question.
Okay, and maybe a new face now for Adam. This question for you. The person's asking, do I understand that excluding helicopter flyovers is being considered?
Thanks, Michelle. So NEPATMA does allow for a total prohibition of air tours. However, at this time, we are focused on gathering public comment on the draft ATMP as published, which would allow it to 946 air tours, with the specified terms and conditions that were discussed tonight that are in the draft ATMP. Thanks, Michelle.
Okay. How about this next one for Keith? The question is, how long will the ATMP be in effect once it's finalized?
So really the legislation doesn't provide any requirements as to the duration of an air tour management plan. However, it could be amended at any time by either of the agencies or from an outside request, even for that matter. The agencies would jointly consider any request to amend an air tour management from an interested party, or obviously, as I mentioned, initiate that process on our own for our own reasons. Those requests would need to be made in writing and submitted to both agencies for their review. And it would also require, justification on how the requested amendments would be consistent with the objectives of an air tour management plan in terms of protecting, park resources, visitor experience and enjoyment, and why, from FAA's perspective, it would not have an adverse effect on aviation safety or the national aviation system. FAA will be publishing additional information for interested parties about the form and manner for submitting any subsequent requests for amendments. Notice of amendments to an ATMP. The agencies would publish those in a Federal Register, and there would be public comment period associated with that.
Okay, thanks, Keith. Got a couple more questions that are coming in here. Let's see, this next one will be for Adam. The question is, why doesn't this apply to anyone else? If the objective is to protect and preserve the environment, wouldn't this apply to general aviation as well?
This air tour management process is being conducted under the National Parks Air Tour Management Act. So it's a statute passed by Congress that requires the Park Service and the FAA to work together to manage air tours. And so as written, it only applies to commercial air tours flying below 5,000 feet above ground level and within above a national park and within a half-mile boundary of that park.
Thank you. And this next question for Vicki. They're asking, what, if anything, do the operators pay the National Park Service or Great Smoky Mountains for the right to operate in or over the park?
The National Park Service is authorized by the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1993 to collect commercial air tour fees for all aircraft conducting tours in the airspace only over certain parks. Those parks currently are Grand Canyon National Park, Hawaii Volcanoes National Park, and Haleakala National Park. There are no other parks that are authorized to collect air tour fees. So currently, the National Park Service does not collect air tour fees for air tours over Great Smoky Mountains National Park.
Okay, and we have another question that's kind of a little bit of a different spin on something that was asked earlier. The question is simply not allowing any air tourism an option for this management plan? And thanks for that question. So Adam did mention earlier in response to the earlier question that NEPATMA does allow for a total prohibition of air tours, but this current draft ATMP is not actually proposing that. If there's additional clarification that the commenter would like, feel free to continue to submit your questions in the chat, and we're happy to get at any additional details that might be helpful. And it looks like we've kind of come to a bit of a slow spot. Maybe a couple are still coming in. So we're going to give those on the line a little bit of time now to think through, and we'll hold the meeting, as I mentioned earlier. We'll keep it live until 6 p.m. But I'd like to just give it a little bit of time for others to finish typing in their questions. As Superintendent Cash mentioned earlier, we really do want to hear from you. So please keep them coming in. I'm going to go off camera for just a little bit while you have time to put your questions in, and we'll be back on here again shortly. Okay, We've had one more question come in, and we'll send this over to Keith. The question is, would the National Park Service and the FAA consider an alternate plan for the Great Smoky Mountain National Park?
Well, certainly we've got a draft plan out on the street for 30-day public review at this point, and we're actively soliciting input from the public at large about this plan. If you would offer suggestions for changes or modifications to this plan, we would certainly consider those. If you wanted to propose a entirely different plan, that would also be a comment that we would consider. But we are actively looking for input regarding at least the proposal we've put out there. But if there's other considerations or things you would like us to consider, we would certainly take a look at those and consider those. Obviously, we're also required to do other consultations with the Fish and Wildlife Service on Section 7, with tribes and other consulting parties related to Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. So all those other parties are also potentially weighing in on the plan on the street that we have right now. So just a lot of different stakeholders with potential input for this plan or options, other options that maybe we haven't considered at this point.
Okay, I'm looking over to the question sheet, and it looks like it's pretty quiet. We may have one more question coming in, so I'm gonna give it another couple of minutes and see if folks have other things that pop into your head. And we're here to answer the questions, so please keep submitting them. Thank you. Okay, I think we have another question that just came in here, and we'll send this over to Adam. The question is, why wasn't more recent data used in the development of this plan? Wouldn't it have made more sense to use flight information from the past 3 years instead of from 2017 to 2019?
Sure, thanks, Michelle. Great question. When this planning process actually started, the full set 2020 data was not available. Further, the pandemic created great uncertainty for trying to use the 2020 and 2021 data. Air tour reporting can change year over year. And so one of the reasons that we used multiple years was to capture this variability. And that's why we did 2017 to 2019.
Thanks for that clarification, Adam. Again, it looks like we may have 1 or 2 questions that are possibly still coming in, so we'll give folks time to get everything typed out, and we'll be back here in just a moment. Okay, thank you guys for staying on. It looks like we have another question that came in, and we'll send it over to Adam. The question is the proposed altitude measured from sea level, or is it a distance above the terrain? 1,500 feet above sea level is lower than my house. They must maintain a certain altitude above the park and a half-mile radius.
Thanks for that, Michelle, and great question. So what we're talking about here is the distance above the terrain, and what we call that, it's above ground level. So in the presentation, we talked about AGL, or above ground level. So what we're not talking about is above sea level, which is often referred to as mean sea level, or MSL. So the altitudes that the operators are flying in between 1,500 feet above ground level, and the proposal draft ATMP suggests that we will raise that to 2,600 feet above ground level. And that does include any terrain feature within 2,000 lateral feet. of that actual route.
Okay, thanks, Adam. Let's see here. Looks like we might have one more question coming in, so just give us another minute or two, and as soon as we have it here, we'll get to it. So just one moment. Thank you. Okay. Well, it looks like we had one more question come in, or make maybe more of a comment. And the commenter is asking us to interpret certain sections of NEPATMA. What we would like to say is if you have comments on what is the appropriate NEPA pathway, we'd like for you to submit those as part of the official record in Pepsi, or you can submit it by mail. That's how the agencies would like to receive those comments. So thank you for that. And with that, it looks like we're done with the questions. And we're coming now to the end of the meeting. So I'm going to share a telephone number here in case there's folks of you that are only like listening and not watching, because FAA will drop the phone number into the chat. But if you don't have access to the chat, I want to make sure that you grab a pen or a pencil to write down the phone number. And just to clarify, the phone number that we're providing is so that you have, if you think of any post-meeting questions or would like some follow-up, you can call that with clarifying questions. We don't use the phone number for receiving official comment. Official comment is received through the Pepsi site. So that phone number, and if FAA could drop it into the chat, please. That phone number is 865-436-1207. And I'll read it again here just in case I spoke too fast. That phone number is 865-436-1207. 1207. So again, that's a phone number you can call for clarifying questions after the meeting. You'll see on the screen here, we're still sharing the link to the website for Pepsi. That's how we're receiving the comments, and the mailing address. If you prefer to use regular postal mail to submit your comments, you can use it that way too. A reminder that if you want your comments to be received as part of the official record, they need to be submitted on or before October 3rd. So thanks again for your participation. On behalf of both the FAA and the NPS, we do look forward to hearing from you. Have a good rest of your evening and take care. Bye.